Hi, and welcome back to our series on the end times in chronological order. I'll be reviewing this today as part of the Theofaith ministry. My goal in this ministry is really to encourage you to get into the Word yourself. I think it's much more important for you to be reading God's Word prayerfully, consistently, than to be listening to me. So this is to encourage you to get in there and study yourself. I'd like to build you up, edify you in the Word, give you reason to get into the Word and build you up in it, maybe clear up some questions you had, and equip you to carry out the ministry that the Lord has entrusted to you. Each of us has a ministry. Each of us has something that we are called to do in service to the Lord, and I want to make some small contribution to equipping you for that ministry. So welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at the end times, as I said, in chronological order. My goal in this is to really give you an introduction to this. It's not exhaustive. There's a lot of great teachers on the internet that look into these particular issues that I'm discussing in much more depth and detail. I'm trying to give you the overview. I pray that you're in a church where eschatology or the end times are taught. I think that's so important to our life and to our holiness. Today we're going to be looking at a particular aspect called the Battle of Gog and Magog. And I'll be discussing where this battle fits in to the overall scheme of end times events. So in this picture, I've tried to lay out graphically the core events of the related to the last days. We have the time we're living in now, the church age. I've related that to Revelation 1 through 3. Then that's followed by a 7-year tribulation in Revelation 6 through 19. And we've talked about what kicks that off and some of the main events during that tribulation. That'll be followed by Christ's 1,000-year kingdom, a millennial kingdom that he'll set up. At the end of that, Satan is released, and a battle ensues, and then there's a large, what's called a white throne judgment at the end of that point, and we enter into the eternal state. During that 7-year tribulation, we see the reign of the Antichrist, and we'll go into any of the other details there because I want to focus on these three triangles that are, I don't know if you could read it, but it says Ezekiel 38 and 39. If you haven't read those two chapters, I'd encourage you to stop the video now, go to Ezekiel 38 and 39, and read those chapters. Now that you're back, there's basically three options as to where this war in Ezekiel 38 and 39 fits in. And there's a lot of disagreement here. A lot of these events that I'm discussing, the particulars about them, there'll be disagreement on. We could still be brothers and disagree. It takes us back to the Word and gets us reading more and more closely, which are all good things. So there's 5 timing options about when does this war happen. One option is that it happens during the book of Esther, right at the end in Esther chapter 9, when Israel is fighting for their lives. Some will posit that this happens before the tribulation begins. Others look at these events and say, well, this must be the Battle of Armageddon at the end of the tribulation. Others say, no, it's not the Battle of Armageddon, but it's the Battle of Jerusalem at the end of the millennial kingdom. And still others say that what we're really dealing with here is 2 wars. So I'm going to take each of these options and look at the first 2 together, and we'll walk through these options and I'll give you my view. So the preterist position is that this war is already complete. So a preterist believes that the prophetic events have either all been completed or most of them have been completed. And some very prominent people, R.C. Sproul and Hank Hanegraaff, Gary DeMar, would class themselves as full or partial preterists. But I think if we look closely at Esther, particularly chapter 9, and compare that with Ezekiel 38 and 39, there's a lot of dissimilarities between those two battles. Things just don't line up for me. So in Esther 9, for example, we see the Jews are actually living among their enemies. And in the War of Ezekiel 38 and 39, the Israels come from regions that are far from Israel to Israel. And Israel is invaded, which is another difference. The war in Esther 9 is happening in Persia, not in Israel. In Esther 9, we see the enemies destroyed by a coalition that's supporting the Jews, also includes the Jews, but there's a Jewish-Gentile interaction here. In Ezekiel 38 and 39, we see the enemies destroyed by God, and he's using supernatural means to make that happen. In Ezekiel or Esther 9, we don't see a regenerate Israel at this point. There may be some regenerate there, but in Ezekiel 38 and 39, they are regenerated. Again, in Esther, this war is not taking place in Israel, so we don't see dead bodies all over the land of Israel, but in the War of Ezekiel 38 and 39, particularly chapter 39, we see that the land of Israel has to be purified because of all the dead bodies. Ezekiel 38 and 39 ends with a fire that comes down and falls on enemies. And then we don't see that happening in Esther at all. And Esther closes with the Feast of Purim, right? A commemorative feast to annually remember that survival, how God intervened. But what we see in Ezekiel 38 and 39 is that the battle in those two chapters then is followed by the millennial kingdom in chapters 40 to 48. So I think there's a sequence in Ezekiel that we don't see in Esther. So I think we got to ignore those and say that it's not the war of Esther 9. And let's take a look at the option of whether this occurs before the tribulation. Now this is really popular. This is probably the thing that you'll encounter most. I don't take this view. I take a kind of a minority view. But lots of very good, well-respected, well-known dispensationalists like Ron Rhodes, Tommy Ice, Arnold Fruchtenbaum, Tim LaHaye, and Ed Henson. I mean, who am I to disagree with these guys? But I do. They hold this view. They will, we have this view that the rapture can happen at any moment. It's called imminency. So in order to say that, preserve that doctrine, in other words, in order to be able to say that the war doesn't have to occur before the rapture, they will say that it may happen between the rapture and the tribulation. So as you know, there's a gap there. Or others say it may happen before the tribulation. We're not sure. In other words, that preserves the doctrine of imminency in their mind. So the arguments, I think, that are made to support this view center around the fact that at the beginning of the war in Ezekiel 38 and 39, Israel's at peace and secure in the land. So I quoted from Ron Rhodes here to that effect. He says that his assessment is that Israel is already in a state of relative security. Really? And that the invasion will likely take place sometime after the rapture, but before the beginning of the tribulation period. Prophecy scholar Thomas Ice agrees, so I get 2 for 1 here, and suggests that the invasion will be during the interval of days, weeks, months, or years before the rapture and the start of the 7-year tribulation. If you need to, you can go back to my video on the tribulation. The tribulation starts when the prince makes or enforces a covenant with Israel at the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel, that lasts 7 years. So it doesn't start at the rapture. It starts when this agreement is made, this covenant, and the covenant's broken, of course, halfway through. But both Ron Rhodes, and he's quoting Tommy Ice, so both Ron Rhodes and Tommy Ice think that the battle's going to happen sometime in that gap between when we're raptured and the tribulation begins. Tim LaHaye and Ed Henson, same view here. In other words, they say there's no reason to relegate the invasion to a mid or post-tribulation setting when the present pre-tribulational setting, that is Israel at peace, already meets these conditions. Even so, the invasion probably will not take place until after the rapture of the church. So they're adding here that there's no reason to put this into a later setting when the pre-tribulation setting works just fine, and it's probably going to happen after the rapture, but before the tribulation begins. But you know, I look at that and I've got to scratch my head a little bit. How can we say that Israel's at peace and secure in the land? Got some headlines here. They're a little bit dated, but you could see the escalation of tension, the expectation of war is rampant in the Middle East. I don't know in what way we could say that the Middle East is at peace. Listen to what Benjamin Netanyahu, I think he's got a couple more days left in office unless things change, but while he was president of Israel, he says famously, it's quoted frequently, if the Arabs put down their weapons today, there would be no more violence. If the Jews put down their weapons today, there'd be no more Israel. So in what way could we say that Israel is in a sense of peace and security? Especially the people who are responsible for the peace and security don't think that they're in a state of peace and security right now. Another thing that I think Mark Hitchcock has really astutely pointed out here, and if you don't have Mark Hitchcock's book, The End, I'd really encourage you to get that. But at any rate, Hitchcock notices that Ezekiel 38, 8 and 16 says that the events described there are going to happen during the latter times and last days of Israel, not the last days of the church. He says the phrases latter years and last days are clues. He says these Old Testament terms refer to the last days for Israel, which extends from the beginning of the tribulation to the millennium. So that would put that war somewhere in that time frame. Mark Hitchcock says, I believe this clue renders it highly unlikely that the battle will happen any time before the tribulation. The tribulation period inaugurates the latter days for Israel, and the battle will happen sometime after that. So I think Dr. Hitchcock is, again, observing the text here and making a very important observation that this is not the last days of the church, but during the last days of Israel. And finally, again, we saw in recent weeks this war between Hamas and Israel waging. Does the Abraham Accords, the recent agreements between Israel and its neighbors, actually make Israel more secure? I don't think it does. I don't think we can say that these things are making Israel more secure in the land. Look what's happened just recently. They've been at war again with Hamas, and the current ceasefire is widely expected not to hold. So again, I don't think we could say that this pre-tribulation time frame for the battle doesn't make sense scripturally or doesn't make sense geopolitically at this point. So I think we can eliminate Esther 9 and before the tribulation. Let's look at two more, the end of the tribulation and the end of the millennium. So as you recall in the book of Revelation, the time of the tribulation goes from chapter 6 through 19. And in chapter 19, the Lord returns amidst the battle we call Armageddon. I think in my analysis of Revelation, it's probably more of a campaign than a specific battle. But if we just compare what the Bible says about that battle of Armageddon with what's in Ezekiel 38 and 39, they don't seem to be the same war. So at Armageddon, there is a battle. In Ezekiel 38 and 39, it doesn't seem to be. I mean, it ends suddenly. We see all nations coming to the battle of Armageddon. They're all dragged together, fooled by Satan and drawn together into battle. Whereas in Ezekiel 38 and 39, 38 particularly, we see enemies coming from the west and from the north. In the Battle of Armageddon, it is this Valley of Jehoshaphat, this broad, empty plain that Napoleon said was a perfect venue for war, where the enemies are destroyed. But in Ezekiel 39, the enemies are destroyed in the mountains. At the beginning of the Battle of Armageddon, Israel is not secure. I mean, they've gone through tribulation. The Lord is treading out the winepress. But in Ezekiel 38, we see Israel is secure. They're at peace in the land. There's massive bloodletting associated with Armageddon. Incredible amount of blood and carcasses as a result. But none of that's reported in Ezekiel 38 and 39. And we see that, again, at Armageddon, they're destroyed by fire, or not destroyed by fire, but destroyed in battle by the returning Lord Jesus. In Ezekiel 38 and 39, it's fire descends and annihilates the enemies instantly. So I think there's major differences that would rule out Armageddon being the battle of Ezekiel 38 and 39. After the Battle of Armageddon in Revelation 19, we see the establishment of the millennial kingdom in Revelation 20, and Satan is bound for 1,000 years, but at the end of that 1,000 years, Satan is released. He is able again to deceive the nations and bring them to war against Jerusalem. That's what happens at the end of Revelation 20. And some people say that's the same war as Ezekiel 38 and 39. So I've kind of adapted some things from Dr. Pentecost, who's gone with the Lord now, and again showing that it doesn't seem to line up, that the Revelation 20 war is not the same as the Ezekiel 38 and 39 war. So in Revelation 20, all the nations come against Jerusalem one final time. And again, in Ezekiel 38 and 39, we see basically a northern invasion. In Revelation 20, we have the millennium, then the invasion. In Ezekiel, we have the invasion first, we have the war, and then the millennium. Same thing, too, with the invasion in Revelation is followed by the eternal state. So you have the millennium, an invasion, judgment, the eternal state. In Ezekiel, you have the invasion, the millennium, and that's it. In Revelation 20, the dead bodies are consumed immediately. In Ezekiel 38 and 39, we have the 7-month period where the dead bodies are disposed of. And in Revelation 20, as I said, Satan was bound at the beginning of Revelation 20. Satan is not bound at all during the invasion of Ezekiel 38 and 39. So, again, this option doesn't seem to fit at all. So what we're left with is this two wars hypothesis, which is what I would subscribe to. This is in a book, I'm looking for it, I think I got it on my shelf handy here, called integrity of heart, skillfulness of hands. And it's a chapter that was contributed by the late Dr. Harold Honer from Dallas Seminary. And he looked at this and said, well, what we have is two wars. So the framework, Daniel's framework for the 70th week, which begins with a covenant, and then there's a 7-year, that starts a 7-year period that's interrupted after 3.5 years by a breaking of the covenant, provides us the framework. And we place Ezekiel 38 and 39 in this framework at the beginning of the latter half of the tribulation, and then Ezekiel 39 at the end of that last half of the tribulation. So, we see, first of all, that Ezekiel 38 and 39 are not describing one war, which is often assumed, but actually two wars. So if you compare, for example, the nations participating, in Ezekiel 38 and 39, we see nations from the north and the south that are going to wage war against Israel. In Ezekiel 39, we only see nations that are south of Israel. So there's a difference there. If we compare the events of Ezekiel 38 with the tribulation, we see that those events surrounding Ezekiel 38 align closely with the things in the middle of the tribulation, whereas Ezekiel 39 align more closely with things that happened at the end. Verse 8 in chapter 38 describes the regathering of Israel. And at the end of chapter 39, we see what is the new covenant spiritual restoration of Israel, which is going to precede them going into the land in the millennial kingdom. Ezekiel 38 says that the events described there will happen when Israel has this sense of security that we talked about before, of betah. But there's no mention of security at all in the book, in chapter 39 of Ezekiel. So these seem to be some telling differences in my mind. It also lines up with the progressive restoration theme that we see in the last part of Ezekiel. And you can see this if you lay it out chapter by chapter. Ezekiel 33, we see Ezekiel commissioned as a watchman that's warning of judgment and promising restoration. So he's anticipating restoration. When we move into chapter 34 of Ezekiel, the false shepherds are contrasted with the true shepherd, which is the coming Messiah. So this is consistent with this expectation of restoration, that it's going to be brought by the Messiah. In chapter 35, we see Israel's longtime enemy, Edom, being destroyed. And in verse 36, we see these repeated promises from Israel's history of first a scattering and then a regathering and then a new covenant restoration. This leads us to chapter 37, where we see kind of a two-stage restoration of Israel. The first stage is to the land in unbelief. So that brings them to the land, and I think this sets the stage for the peace agreement that's going to start the tribulation in Daniel chapter 9. So these events are preceding the war, and then the war begins. They set the stage for that beginning of the tribulation. They're at peace, they're in the land, that covenant's been set, and then in the middle of it, the covenant's broken, the peace is disturbed, and we see this opposition to Israel. And then finally, in verses 40 to 49 of Ezekiel, we see things that are going to happen during the millennial kingdom and beyond. The millennial temple is established, there's worship, and this is happening while Israel is in the land. So this aligns really well with the idea that there's going to be a 1,000-year millennial kingdom for Christ after these wars. I think the two wars also align with Daniel 9:27, as I've alluded to here. In Daniel 9:27, the prince is called, and turn to that, take a look at that. The prince makes a covenant guaranteeing Israel's security at the beginning of the 70th week. And then halfway through that, the covenant is broken. So this covenant of security is broken then halfway through. And I think if we line up, as I said, chapter 38 of Ezekiel with this, we see that this then comes the northern and southern invasion that Ezekiel 38 talks about. This is prompting the cancellation of that covenant. So, in other words, the sequence here is that the prince makes a covenant. The covenant lasts for 3.5 years. At the end of that 3.5-year period, an invasion comes. So they're at peace, but an invasion comes, and the covenant is then broken. In Daniel 11, then, we see the king of the south and the north attacks the prince or the king. And this would be Jesus, the Messiah. And then he enters the land and defeats the attackers. And this initiates the Battle of Armageddon. So these things seem to line up well. And again, there's the reference to Dr. Honer's essay on this. So I think for these reasons, the best way to look at this is with regard to a two-war hypothesis. Ezekiel 38 is aligned with the middle of the tribulation. Ezekiel 39 then with the Battle of Armageddon. Two separate wars. In the future, I'll have a detailed exposition online of the book of Revelation, and you could follow up in that and see how this gets organized and some of the details associated with this. But again, my goal here was to give you the end times overview, an introduction to give you the big picture, and encourage you to go dig in yourself and look at the details of this. It'll be very edifying for you, and I think it'll help you to live in light of Jesus' coming in anticipation of his return. So God bless you, and thanks for watching this, and may God bless your studies of end times events.